Seja bem-vindo a mais uma edição do programa Todas as Palavras. Nunca me perguntei sobre o significado da liberdade até ao dia em que abracei Stalin. Assim começa este livro, Livre, como me tornei adulta no fim da história, a autoria de Lea YPI, que aos 11 anos começou a desconfiar de que algo se passava, não só no seio da sua família, mas também no seu país. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, Lea. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, at 11, you start thinking that something wasn't quite well, not even in your family, in your house, but also in your country.
Yes, this was 1990, 1 year after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I lived in Albania, which was until then still a communist country. And I had grown up thinking that I was living in the freest country in the world, where I knew there was scarcity. Sometimes we had to queue for things, but we had a party that looked after us and all the children were happy. And this was the place that I was socialized into until in 1990, some protests began on the streets. People were shouting freedom and democracy and tearing down statues of Stalin and Lenin and Enver Hoxha, the Communist Party leader in Albania. And suddenly this question came to me, but we were always told we were free. How come these people want freedom? And this is where the story begins of asking all these questions about what does it mean to live freely, and if we are really as free as we are told we are when we are children.
Yes, because in those times, biography was the most important thing in your life. It would determine everything about your present and your future, right?
That's right, yes. And people were divided into good biographies and bad biographies. I grew up in a family where I was told that there were some problems with our biography, but I was never told what kind of problems there were. And it's only in 1990 when everything began to be questioned and people started to suddenly see the world in very different ways from how they had seen it up to that point, that I discovered that both the country that I had lived in up to that point was not as free as I was told, but also that the family that I had grown up into was not the kind of compliant family that loved communism as much as I did.
Actually, you have to tell your colleagues, your student colleagues, that you had nothing to do with the former prime minister of the country. But then you realized that wasn't exactly like that.
Yeah, there was this former Albanian prime minister who was in every history book when I was a child for being a fascist collaborator because he had given the crown of Albania to the Italian occupier when they invaded the country in 1939. He happened to have the same name and surname as my father. And at home, this was always dismissed as something like this always
a coincidence.
Happens. Yes, people can have the same name and the same surname, and no one ever talked about who he was in relationship to who we were until the system collapsed, and I was told that this man was actually my great-grandfather.
Who determined what happened to your family after that, right? Because your parents struggled a lot to survive. Your father seems that, he was a little more political active, if we can say that in these days. Your mother more worried about your life at home and your well-being, right? But there was also always something strange. And for start, you spoke French.
Yeah, so
that
this
was a little bit awkward,
yes,
right?
There was always, when I was growing up, there was always something a bit funny about my family. And I think French was the first.
Funny is a good word.
The French was the first element of strangeness because I had this grandmother who raised me and to whom I was very strongly attached. And the first language she spoke to me was French. And I always found it strange because no other children in communist Albania spoke French to their grandmothers. Also, she wasn't French. She didn't grow up in France. She spoke French with a heavy Albanian accent. And so I never understood why we have to speak French. And whenever I asked her, why do we have to speak this language that in some ways is not naturally connected to us? She said, but you like the French Revolution, don't you? Or you like Les Miserables. There was a puppet show with Cosette when I was a child that I really loved. And so she always made these very spurious connections between France and my life. And again, it was only in 1990 that I discovered that the reason she spoke French to me was that she came from this Albanian aristocratic family who had lost everything after the arrival of communists to power. And French was the language that these elites of the Ottoman Empire spoke to each other as the language of the elite in late 19th century, early 20th century Europe. And she had this very strong class identity, which somehow she transmitted and wanted to transmit in one way or another through this language that was French, that was not a cultural language, but a class language almost. And that was the way in which she was passing on to me those bits of the past and of her past that she couldn't really explain or pass in any other way.
You talked about funny stories, and there is some funny stories in this book. For example, for us today, it's imaginable how well, we will say a soda can. We are not going to say the brand, can be a so important object in a house, and your family had a conflict because of that with your neighbors. Can you share that story?
Yeah, so this is again one of those moments where it's something seemed strange. In every family in communist Albania in those days, one of the markers of social status, of encounter or having come to contact with the West at one point or another, was to have one of those cans of the drinks that were being sold everywhere, but not in communist countries. So this kind of imperialist drinks, sweet drinks that you wouldn't find locally. And those cans were usually exposed empty in someone's bookshelf or living room. And there was a whole black market that traded into these cans that came from abroad. And my family, my mom, at some point, she had bought this can, this empty can, from someone. And at one point, the can disappeared from our shelf. And there was this huge fight with his neighbors because she suddenly accused the neighbor of taking the can because the can reappeared in her living room the day after. And this was one of these episodes where I was very upset because these were our closest neighbors with whom we shared everything. They had the key to our house. They knew where our savings were. They knew they could look after me if my parents were gone. So there was a very, very tight connection and very strong trust between those two families. And they had this massive fight about this can at one point. And I remember after they made up and reconciled that I was bringing this question up, but why do you fight about this can? And it was in that conversation and in that exchange between those two families that again something transpired about my family and about their commitment to the system. And also about the fact that suddenly it occurred to me that these people, why did they fetishize this object? And the object wasn't... It's interesting, that object is now in every shop in Albania. It's a kind of mass commodity, mass-produced. Everyone sees it. Everyone sees the advertising around it. But I think in those days, because of its absence, it was almost like a sign of dissidence to have it in your bookshelf, because it was almost like telling the state, this is a place where you can't tell me what to do. And in a very tightly controlled, very censored society, these were these everyday episodes of resilience that stood up.
Yes, and otherwise, you did insist to have a photograph of the Prime Minister, Uncle Enver, and your family always, oh yes, we are taking care of it, but you never saw that photograph at your house, right?
Yeah, exactly. And again, people made excuses, excuses all the time, but they wouldn't tell me what the reason was because they couldn't obviously articulate in front of a child that they didn't like the system, while I was completely fully socialized and really believed in everything that I was told about the greatness of the party and the state.
But then the party fell. The communism fell, but the transition didn't brought you a lot of good things. It was very difficult, right?
Yeah, it was a difficult transition in part because it was both personal and political, collectively difficult. Personally, because it was a transition in identity. You think you live in a kind of family and you think you live in a kind of state, and all those values are suddenly gone, and also you discover that the people that have brought you up are not the people that you thought they were. Moreover, because they had been part of this dissident family, it was as though after 1990, when the new system came into place, they thought that now it was my time and also their time through me to just try and get as good grades as you can in school and to achieve all the things that they had been frustrated and they couldn't achieve because their biography was such a burden. On the other hand, these were very difficult years for the country because the transition after 1990 was accompanied by huge waves of migration, a lot of unemployment, people lost their jobs, there was real scarcity, there was a lot of poverty, disorientation, war, everything. And I remember when I was in high school, for most of the afternoon, didn't have electricity and I had to do my homework with a candle. I couldn't go out because these were the years in which sex trafficking became a huge issue. And if you were a young girl, you were very vulnerable to just being kidnapped and brought somewhere. And I remember this complete gap between how I perceived what I thought freedom was or should be, and the fact that I kept complaining, I have to be at home all day, I can't go out, I have to be with a candle to do my homework. And my parents constantly said, but this is great, this is your time, this is now your moment to succeed and to do all the things that we couldn't do. So there was this huge intergenerational gap and conflict that the book also tries to articulate and speak about how we experience transition very, very differently depending on where we were in the moment where history changes around us.
And at some point, your mother left to Italy with your brother.
Yeah, this was in 97. One of the things that happened in Albania was a big financial collapse, and the pyramid schemes in which people had invested all their monies that they had built after 1990, including remittances from immigrants, all also collapsed, and 2/3 of the country lost their savings. And because we were so poor, my mom, she had to just leave, and there was danger, there was shooting everywhere, it was unsafe. At one point, she just jumped on a boat that was being smuggled outside of our hometown, Durrës, which was on the Adriatic. And I was in my last year of high school, preparing for my final exams, preparing to go to university, and just thinking that it made no sense when you're in the middle of war to think about what do I want to do at university? What do I want to study? You think, okay, medicine, there's so many dead people around me. Law, there is no law, there's a war, it's a complete collapse. Economics, there are all these pyramid schemes that had just collapsed after telling people for years that they had to invest and save and so on. And so it was, again, one of those moments of transition where everything changes and you lose your reference points like your mother, but also the more general reference points in society, and the system of values is all collapsing.
That's why you decided to study philosophy.
Well, yes, because I had so many questions, and philosophy is the kind of discipline that makes you ask good questions. Maybe not always answer them, but it teaches you how to ask good questions, and it kind of matters what kind of questions we ask to ourselves.
But you also wrote this book to find some answers to your questions. Have you found it?
Well, I think I wanted to write about freedom in a way that would, and the book is a book, it's called Free, and it's in many ways a book about the idea of freedom. But on the other hand, I also think that it's really important when you're talking about freedom to give the reader the freedom to think about it themselves, because a very important part of freedom and of the value of freedom is that we not only are told what the right things are, but that we understand them ourselves, and that there is a right way of asking questions. And so therefore in the book I don't really present, I have my idea of freedom, but I don't lecture people on what I think a free society looks like and what freedom is. What I do instead is present a dialogue between different perspectives and different people, each of which has a different idea of what a free society looks like. And so my mother, who is this very right-wing libertarian character, almost Thatcher-inspired, has this very negative idea of freedom, where, freedom is free from. No one should interfere with you, no one should tell you what to do, where to go, how to behave. My father was more socially minded, had a more social idea of freedom. So he thought that it's not enough to be told that you are free from this and that. You also have to have certain opportunities. And so you have to have education, you have to have income. If you don't have these things, then freedom doesn't mean anything, because there's no freedom to live under the bridge. And my grandmother, yet again, because she had experienced so many different transitions in her life, she had a more moral idea of freedom, where it was all about making the right decisions, even under very dire circumstances. And so she had a much more inner conception of freedom. And in the end, the book is a meditation on what freedom means in all these different characters, also in different social systems, where we try to distinguish between what we are told freedom is by the dominant ideology. And I think there is a dominant ideology in communism, just as there is in capitalist societies, and there is a way in which the world is presented to us, and distinguishing between what that ideological idea of freedom is and what the real freedom is after we ask ourselves the right questions.
There is no perfect system, right?
Well, I think there is a reflection on how to get to this. I don't think that anyone has a kind of magic answer, but I think there are criticisms that we can all come up with and that make us question the systems under which we live. And I think in the end, the perfect system is the system that we all construct together, having eliminated the kinds of conflicts that prevent us from reaching this real ideal.
Looking at our world nowadays, do you think that that is happening?
Well, I think I want to be, this is a time in which many people are very pessimistic about the world and where we look around and we tend to think about how terrible things are now compared to how they might have been 20, 30 years ago. I want to look at the bright sides of our predicament and where we are now. And I think perhaps one insight that is emerging is that we were for decades, especially if you came from Eastern Europe, former communist countries, in a predicament of societies that were constantly being told what the right way of living was, where these capitalist societies, United States, Great Britain, European Union countries, were there lecturing everyone else on how they should conduct themselves. I think now we've come to a position where we see that there's a real crisis of democracy and a real crisis in all these societies. Even the mainstream advanced capitalist countries that were lecturing around the world and telling them that everyone should model after them are now in some ways offering a very negative image of themselves. And while that politics presents us with lots of challenges, I think it's also an opportunity to understand that actually there is no perfect system out there, and none of the models that we believed were the right models are actually the ones that we should aspire to, because look at what happens to them. And to be really critical about the kinds of markets that we have, the kinds of politics that we have, about the way we establish our social relations, and to start from this very radical criticism, hoping to construct something without those hierarchies of the civilized and the civilizing, and the ones that need to learn and the ones that have lessons to teach.
Well, you dedicate this book to your grandmother. We kind of have some clues why why you decided to do that. But why did you decide to dedicate this book to your grandmother?
Well, for both personal and political reasons, because I was very close to her. She was someone with a lot of experience of also navigating these different systems. And as I say, she grew up in the Ottoman Empire, then lived in communist Albania, then lived the post-communist period. And she always had this insight about freedom, which is the one that I share. She said, we never lose the inner freedom, which is the freedom to do what is the right thing to do, to do the moral thing. And she believed that there is something about the human being, about our moral core, our moral agency, that can never get fully degraded under any circumstances. And that's the standard from which we should then construct society and construct social critique. And I think that's a very important insight that I took away with me, because it makes you question critically all the institutions that surround you and all the authorities that tell you that this is now freedom and you have to believe me, and exercise a kind of skepticism and critical thinking and doubt, which is, I think, really important for improving things and for learning from the past.
You managed to get out of Albania? How were those years when you...
They were difficult, very difficult, also in part because there was this expectation that the problem is in Albania and that once you get out of Albania, you will find freedom. In where I studied was in Italy in the 90s. I had gone to study philosophy, and where you thought this is now my opportunity to succeed. And then you realize that there are all these forms of anonymous oppression and all this structural inequalities or forms of racism that you had no idea about before when you were living in your own country with its own challenges, but different kinds of challenges from the challenges of an immigrant in the West. And those, in particular, those early years in Italy were the years of greatest racism against Albanians. And I was a student. I just was never used to thinking of myself as someone who stood out because of their nationality. In my biography, in my family, class differences had always been much more important. And the fact that we came from this old dispossessed class, bourgeois, aristocratic, had mattered a lot during communism. And suddenly to discover that in Italy, all those internal differences in Albania make no difference. And what really signals you and what makes you stand out is your nationality, and the racism that comes with that was something that I needed to somehow learn to live with and learn to navigate.
there is a problem that immigrants are facing, not here in the United Kingdom, but also, for example, in Portugal. We are receiving a lot of people who are trying to escape from their countries, looking for a better life. How do you see this phenomenon? Because in a way, you have experienced that. How do you look at this phenomenon, and how do you think governments are dealing with this? I'm going to say problem. I think it is a problem, but a problem of giving the good conditions to these people to develop themselves and make something useful with their lives.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I think migration is a really useful prism from which to see all the ideological discourse around freedom and to also see it in its naked, brutal truth in a way. And when you think about migration, you're talking about freedom of movement. And coming from a former communist country, the discourse around freedom of movement that characterized the years of isolation was one where the Western countries would tell the Eastern countries, how can you prevent people from traveling? You know, anyone who's been to Berlin Wall will be confronted with these shocking images of people who tried to run away from East Berlin and were shot at the border, and the moral disgust and outcry on the side of Western liberal capitalist countries who said, how can you do this, people? How can you prevent people from leaving? How can you disrespect freedom of movement? And so freedom of movement was a really important value. Now, the minute this was no longer the case, these were no longer communist countries, people could travel freely, that was a point where Albanians were no longer wanted. They were no longer welcome. And not just Albanians, but a lot of other countries, where Eastern European states dismantled their borders and Western European states erected them, and they were keeping people out. And so you ask yourself, when you think about migration, which is, as I say, fundamentally a question of freedom of movement, well, is freedom only prevented and only limited when you prevent exits, or is it also when you're preventing someone from entering a country? So I can tell you we are free to leave this room, but if we go outside and all the doors are locked and we can't get in anywhere, then freedom of exit makes no difference if there is no guaranteed freedom of entrance in a way. And so you can really see this asymmetry between exit and entrance, where the countries who are stopping their citizens from leaving were criminals and murderers, but now the countries that are stopping people from coming in, and so from also exercising their freedom of movement, which they thought was really important, are considered completely in their right to do so because they have to protect their values or they have to protect their ways of life. And for me, that's a really good way to see the cynicism and the ideological lens through which the whole discourse on migration is being constructed. Because if you care about freedom, and freedom is a universal value, and you think freedom of movement is a good that needs to be protected, then the discussion shouldn't be how do we prevent people from exercising that freedom. It should be about justice, about asymmetric flows, about who comes in and what kind of categories of people are wanted or unwanted. And generally, it's not true that that people don't welcome immigrants. I mean, rich immigrants are always very welcome. No one has a problem with tourists. No one has a problem with people who consume or who buy citizenship. It's usually about a particular category of immigrant. So I think there's a way of thinking about all these issues that is really important when you want to think consistently about freedom.
Livre, como me tornei adulta no fim da história, a autoria de Lea YPI. Thank you so much. Estas foram algumas de todas as palavras. Pode ver ou rever este e outros programas na plataforma RTP Play e na nossa página no Facebook. Regressamos na próxima semana. Boas leituras.